All right. Thanks
Yeah.
so much, Eileen, for that kind of introduction. And so, I always like to start by taking folks to Antarctica with me. And I realize a lot of you have probably been there or worked down there. But here we are, this icy continent at the bottom of the world. And I want to share with you that before the continent was ever discovered, ancient Greeks actually insisted that a great southern land must exist in symmetry with the north. Without it, they said, the entire earth would topple over. And I love this metaphor because the Greeks were essentially right. Because since its discovery, scientists have, of course, documented that the Antarctic stores 90% of the world's fresh water, it regulates our climate, and it drives global ocean circulation. And despite its harsh conditions, the Antarctic waters actually teem with life. And in fact, Antarctica contains some of our last healthy marine ecosystems left. To illustrate that is just a slide showing you a study that was in Science in 2008. It's the global impact of humans on the oceans, and the spectrum is from red to blue. So all you really need to know is that all areas in red are areas that were heavily damaged or highly impacted, and all the areas in blue are the few areas we have left that are still intact or healthy. And so you can see a lot of this is some of these high latitude areas around Antarctica. So why do we have these healthy marine systems around Antarctica? Well, part of it is Antarctica is kind of protected by a shield of ice, especially every winter. You can see that big shield of ice that forms around it. But it's also very remote, very far away. But it's not just ice and remoteness, it's also political will. In the Antarctic, we have this rich history of exploration and science that has created an amazing framework for international collaboration and data sharing, where scientists work side by side despite diplomatic tensions. And it's possible that some of you have even experienced this, where countries might be fighting over things, but you get to Antarctica and work together despite that. And just to show you the kind of diplomatic tensions we historically had in Antarctica, this is a map of sovereignty claims that were placed throughout the 1800s and 1900s. So imagine this map being around 1942. You can see that there's 7 different countries that claim parts of Antarctica. That was Chile, Argentina, the UK, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, and France. At the time, the United States and USSR also reserved their right to claim the whole thing. So we had these really intense diplomatic tensions, these overlapping territories around the peninsula. And at the time, there was real fear that Antarctica would become this scene of international discord, where the United States was actually sending troops to Antarctica to train them to fight. And there was also concern that USSR would use it as a place to launch nuclear war from. And so there were these real fears that Antarctica would be this militarized continent. But incredibly, based on this amazing framework we have for international collaboration through science, and in particular, there was a 1957-58 International Geophysical Year. This set up a real framework for data sharing, for sharing infrastructure and bases. And that framework that was created for shared science actually led directly to a political collaboration and the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. And despite all those tensions I described to you, despite all those competing sovereignty claims. And the treaty is amazing. It sets aside the entire continent for the sake of peace and science. And under the Antarctic Treaty System, it grants freedom of science, it prohibits military operations, it prohibits any nuclear activity. Antarctica is one of our largest nuclear-free zones in the world. It suspends sovereignty, so all those claims I showed to you are actually suspended under the treaty, and later agreements actually banned mining as well. So I can't emphasize enough how absolutely amazing this is. Originally, we had 12 signatories, and now we have closer to 53. And I really have to emphasize what an amazing thing this is, that Antarctica serves as a de facto world park, and it is truly one of our greatest achievements in the world. Now, under the Antarctic Treaty System is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR. And CAMLR currently has 27 member states, and all decisions are made by consensus, and it has to be unanimous consensus. So you can see the flags of all the countries that are currently members. And in line with the principles of the treaty, grounded in science and precaution, CAMLR is actually considered a leader in marine resource management, where they have a very precautionary science-based ecosystem approach to their management. And so fishing is allowed, but it has strict ecosystem principles that it is supposed to follow. So there are two main species currently harvested in the Southern Ocean, or two main groups, I should say. One is for krill, and that's for Antarctic krill, and then for toothfish. And Antarctic krill, I'm sure as a lot of you know, is the key species in the Southern Ocean food web. Has a massive biomass, estimated at 300 to 500 million tons. And the fishery is growing in recent years, actually growing quite a bit. And it's not growing for human consumption, it's actually growing for omega-3 pills, so pharmaceutical supplements, and also for fish meal, especially fed to pigs and chickens and salmon. So currently it's not suitable for human consumption in its form. So it's fished mainly for these markets. And there is increasing pressure on this because of these growing markets. And so the catches have been rising in recent years with over 450,000 tons in the last year caught. And part of the problem is that, especially with reductions in sea ice, fishing is increasingly overlapping with areas where predators need to forage, like penguin foraging grounds. The other main fisheries at the other end of the ecosystem web, if you think about it that way, is for the top fish predator in the Southern Ocean, and that's for Patagonian and Antarctic toothfishes. You can see from these pictures how big they get. They're an absolutely massive fish, grow in excess of 2 meters. And they are in a place where we don't have sharks in the high latitude areas of Antarctica. Some people think of toothfish as the shark of Antarctica, where they are by far the largest fish that lives down there and the top fish predator. But they're also a really important prey species. This is a Weddell seal with a toothfish in its mouth. It's very important for Weddell seals, as well as other species, including killer whales. So for toothfish, it's mainly fished to be sold as Chilean sea bass in very up-end, high-market restaurants across the United States, Europe, and Asia. And because it's such a lucrative fishery, Chilean sea bass is also known as white gold. There is increasing pressure to fish these species as well. So I have to say, when I started this work, I was really surprised that we were commercially fishing in Antarctica. And in fact, I fell into a study during my master's of studying the life history of Antarctic toothfish in the Ross Sea, because there was a growing fishery there and there was a paucity of information about the fish and its basic life history. And so I was able to do some age validation work. But I have to say, the first time I went down, I just was so surprised that we literally were sending fishermen to the ends of the earth. The Ross Sea is the most remote fishery in the entire world. So there really is nowhere else left we have to go. And the vessels that go down there are not ice strengthened. They are just, industrial fishing, high seas fishing vessels. And so there are often accidents at sea. Vessels get stuck in the ice. So fishermen literally risking life and limb to fish down there. But this is really in line with global fishing trends. And I feel like this figure summarized it really, really well, where in the 1950s, you can see a lot of it's blue. And so blue being the areas that are undeveloped, or and green being areas that are developing. So those are fisheries that are new and just growing. And then by 2008, and this data is from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, almost 90% of our global fisheries were either collapsed, overexploited, or fully exploited. And so what this means is that there's very few places left in the world for vessels to continue moving to, but they are going into deeper and more remote waters, which is why we end up fishing in places like Antarctica. And this map tries to summarize for you where the main fishing grounds are for krill and toothfish. So krill fisheries are the red bubbles, and toothfish fisheries are the green ones. So you can see that most of the krill fisheries are centered around the peninsula and the Scotia Sea, whereas the toothfish fisheries are scattered throughout. And then this next map gives you a sense of what this looks like according to the different countries that fish in the Southern Ocean. So depending on the year, there's 14 to 16 different countries that fish in Antarctica. And each flag on the map is actually a vessel from that country that notified to fish. So you can see a lot of different countries fishing, but you can see in particular, the peninsula region is very busy with all that krill fishing and some toothfish. The Ross Sea is very busy with toothfish fishing. And then you have ones scattered throughout. And where you see these national flags, aggregated. I'll talk about this a little later, but these are subantarctic islands that fall within the CAMLAR area, but they're outside the treaty area. And so there is sovereignty on these islands. And so those countries have exclusive economic zones. So you can see the flags of Australia and France and South Africa, who each have subantarctic islands, which they have their own EEZs around where they can fish for toothfish. So this is a busy fishing space for sure. And of course, this place is also undergoing rapid change. And this figure tries to summarize the climate change happening in Antarctica. It's very complicated. I don't need to explain that to all of you. You all probably know more about this than I do, but I do like this figure because it at least tries to show you those dramatic changes happening where areas in red are areas warming, which have reductions in sea ice, increased glacial retreat, ice shelf collapse, whereas areas in blue were areas that were cooling. This figure is a few years old at this point, so all these things continue to be in flux and to be studied with these changes happening. And as you can imagine, all these changes have dramatic ecosystem impacts where we're potentially seeing declines in primary productivity in some areas, potential decreases in Antarctic krill, and certainly contractions in where Antarctic krill live, southward contraction, some penguin populations declining. But a lot of this is difficult to understand. What is the impacts of climate change? What is the impacts of natural variability? What is the impacts of fishing, right? And so I've told you a few things right now I just want to remind you of. So we know the Southern Ocean is home to some of the last healthy marine ecosystems left on the planet. We know that CAMLAR is a leader in international ocean management, but I've also told you there's increasing pressure to fish the Southern Ocean and that the system is under this threat of climate change. So what do we do? How do we conserve the Southern Ocean ecosystem and allow for sustainable use of fisheries? How do we do that? Well, marine protected areas are this increasingly popular tool for conserving marine biodiversity and managing fisheries. And the proper definition of a marine protected area, or MPA, is an area where human activities are restricted to meet specific conservation, protection, or fisheries management objectives. And currently, we actually have more than 18,000 MPAs across the world. We're at 8.16% of the ocean. This map shows you where all those different protected areas are. So you can see there's some areas where we have quite large ones, and there's some areas where we have none. So it is the global targets now are calling for between 10 to 30% of our ocean to be protected. And that's because of some of the things I just told you about the Southern Ocean, where there's just increasing threats across the world's oceans from climate change, from overfishing, also from other things like habitat degradation. So why this movement towards protected areas? Well, I really like this graphic because it summarizes what they do. You can see the picture on the left has fewer fish in it, and that's the unprotected area that's still heavily fished, whereas the area on the right shows you graphically what a marine protected area does. So it causes increases in the biodiversity, so the different forms of life that live there, increase in biomass, so the sheer amount of life living there. It also tends to have larger individuals. And so what you can see is the larger fish that tend to be in a marine protected area, and how those larger fish produce more babies, and those babies actually will swim out into the unprotected area, but also those large fish can swim out as well. So that's called a spillover effect, where all that recovery and growth happening within that closed area actually spills over into the unprotected area and can actually be fished. And so this is part of why they're increasingly popular. It's just this increase in biomass, biodiversity, as well as potential benefits to fisheries. Perhaps most importantly for the Southern Ocean, MPAs also enhance resilience. So they maintain all the trophic levels of the ecosystem. And as I mentioned, increase species diversity. They also increase genetic diversity, and that enhances resilience to environmental change, including the impacts of climate change. And more studies are showing this to be true. So CAMLAR, in line with their leadership, they actually, part of their convention allowed for closing areas for science or conservation reasons. So even part of their legal convention is this ability to do marine protected areas, which makes them pretty unique in terms of fisheries management organizations. And there actually was a global movement to designate a network of MPAs by 2012 that was requested and called upon at the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development. And out of that World Summit, actually in 2002, CAMLAR began formally discussing MPAs and created an agenda item and actually committed to that goal of having a network of protected areas across the Southern Ocean by 2012. They did adopt the world's first international marine protected area in 2009, south of the South Orkney Islands, and began moving towards a representative network of protected areas. And what it means to be a representative network is that ideally you have protected areas that will encompass all the different habitats and all the different life that exists in that area. And so for the Southern Ocean, there were these major regionalizations done where we tried to understand what are the different benthic types, what are the different pelagic types, and these are large scale ones I'm showing you. They were also done at finer scales. And the whole idea was to have a network of protected areas that encompasses all these different habitats, all these different bioregions. But one key priority area very quickly in this process was in the Ross Sea, Antarctica, which is pictured before you on the map there. And this area, back to this map I showed you at the start of the talk, in this analysis, this global analysis, the Ross Sea actually stood out as being the healthiest or least damaged large marine ecosystem left in the entire world. And so, it was very much a priority area to protect this potentially last intact place. But Antarctica, I mean, the Ross Sea also is considered to be the most productive stretch to the Southern Ocean. This is actually a picture from NASA showing that phytoplankton bloom that forms in the Ross Sea every summer. And because it's so productive, part of the reason that high productivity can drive abundant wildlife. And so the Ross Sea has been found to hold 35% of the world's Adelie penguins, a quarter of the world's emperors, 30% of the world's Antarctic petrels, and just a host of other life that thrives there. So here's this last place that we were understanding at the time to be potentially this last healthy system. Well, even before that study came out that I showed you, this man, Dr. David Ainley, who's most of you probably know who this guy is, Antarctic ecologist who had been working in the Ross Sea for decades. Well, he saw the threat of the fishing industry early on. So the fishery first came into the Ross Sea in the late 1990s, and David saw it and quickly began advocating for protecting the Ross Sea, arguing that we need this last place to be kept intact as a living laboratory so that scientists can actually study how a healthy marine ecosystem functions. And as early as 2002, David started actually submitting science papers to CAMLAR and their scientific working groups, again, advocating, making a case for, here's this place that we need to keep intact. We need to protect it so that we can actually study it. And David galvanized hundreds of scientists from all over the world to support protecting the Ross Sea, which is pretty extraordinary because a lot of times scientists don't sign petitions or want to raise their voices, but in this case they did, and they were. So some of David's obscure papers he was sending to CAMLAR worked their way into the hands of Boulder, Colorado-based conservation photographer John Weller, pictured here before you. And John had been working in Colorado and was looking for his next sort of big conservation photography project and read David's papers and actually was so struck that there was only one place left in the world's oceans that was undamaged. And he flew out to California to meet with David, and David committed to galvanizing the scientists. John committed to telling the story of the Ross Sea, getting photography, bringing it to the public. And together they branded this place as the last ocean to get into people's heads that here's this last place that we all can stand behind. John also pulled in New Zealand filmmaker Peter Young to actually make a documentary. A lot of the toothfish fisheries come out of New Zealand, at least at the time. New Zealand was really leading fishing in the Ross Sea. So we thought, let's work with a filmmaker there in New Zealand. And so between David, John, and Peter Young, they also recruited me. I think I was one of the few people at the time studying Antarctic toothfish. And John actually called me up and said, we need to talk about toothfish. And ended up flying out to see me in California too, and recruiting me to become part of his team, which turned into a lifelong journey for sure, for John and I both. And we bombarded the world with media, really, like I said, branding this place as the last ocean with written media and photography, an award-winning documentary, like I said, that Peter Young, New Zealand filmmaker, produced, a beautiful photography book that actually John authored and hand-delivered, signed and hand-delivered to all the delegates of CAMLAR at the CAMLAR meeting. And we worked with environmental groups through the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, which is a NGO coalition of many different conservation groups that work all over the world on behalf of Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And we worked with them to produce policy documents, which were made in multiple different languages and released all over the world. And so just on and on, trying to work with these groups all over to publicize this place, and again to use imagery and storytelling to bring the place to life. And I'd like to say that we could just get all the signatures ourselves that we needed and get all the support. But some of the groups we worked with were able to get celebrities on board as well, which of course were a lot more successful than we were sometimes at getting the public excited about this place. Now, CCPO-ICAR meets in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia every October to make policy decisions. And they meet in this pretty stoic building. Stone, feels like a stone fortress when you're in there. And usually there's nobody outside this building. The governments go in, they meet, the public is not allowed to participate in these meetings. But as of 2012, this is what the scene looks like outside CCPO-ICAR, or looked like for many years, where the public was out there protesting, calling for a global network of protected areas around the Southern Ocean, including in the Ross Sea. And I just want to draw your attention to some of the things folks are holding. So there's binoculars, there's balloons with eyes on it. And part of that was trying to hold CCPO-ICAR accountable, saying the public is watching you, we're paying attention to what you're doing. There you are, you know, a government official in a room making a decision on behalf of the public, but we're paying attention and we're watching you, we care about this place. So the public was really putting pressure on CCPO-ICAR in ways that they really never had before. So in the midst of this, David Ainley and others continued to produce an absolute flood of science in support of protecting the Ross Sea. And so I mentioned to you, David started this process in 2002 of writing papers. John came on board shortly thereafter, as well as Peter Young and myself. And then finally, in 2010, the United States and New Zealand both agreed to take the lead on developing a proposal for a Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. In 2011, they both put forward scenarios to CCPO-ICAR's scientific committee of what their different proposals might look like. And that's what you're seeing on the map in front of you. So it took almost 10 years even just to get to the point, 10 years of scientific effort and public engagement to get to the point where these two governments came together to propose a formal marine protected area. And that's the way CCPO-ICAR works, is that it is this multinational commission, but usually one or two or a couple countries have to take leadership on a proposal to bring it forward. And so in this case, New Zealand and the United States did, and part of that is, as you can imagine, the United States has a lot of interest in the Ross Sea. We have McMurdo, which is the largest science base there, and New Zealand has its Scott base and its proximity. And so they were very interested in also taking leadership there. It took many years to develop and modify this proposal to try to find a way to get all of the CCPO-ICAR countries to agree. And here's a picture of the room inside of CCPO-ICAR. And essentially, it's, like I said, it's 27 different member states now. At the time of the negotiations for the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, it was just 25 member states, including the EU. And so you had to get all those different countries to agree. And there they sit around a table together. There's 2 seats for each country, 1 seat for a diplomat and 1 seat for a scientist. And they're the ones who sit at the table, make the decisions, and then they have their supporting sort of staff delegates behind them that also support them. So it is an amazing room in the sense that if you've maybe been to or seen pictures of the United Nations, you have these massive rooms that people are sitting in. But at CCPO-ICAR, it's a pretty small room, and you have these face-to-face interactions where people actually really get to know each other. Some people, including especially some of the scientists, have been in this room for decades, and you do really have these opportunities to build trust in that space. So I just want to share with you this process of building a consensus, especially around marine protected areas and the Ross Sea in particular. And so we have these, like I said at the time, these 25 different member states, and you had to get every single country to agree for a policy to pass. So in the case of the Ross Sea, we had to get every single country to agree to get that in place. And it was this really slow process. So before I started the story in 2002, well, actually, even before then, there were countries at CCPO-ICAR, like the UK, that really started bringing forward the idea of MPAs early on. So introducing that idea, right? And then you had other countries like the US, New Zealand, Belgium, Australia that were hosting science workshops and trying to move towards that. What are the important areas, right, for protection? And then fast forward to 2012, in front of you is the first formal proposal for a Ross Sea Marine Protected Area that came from the US and New Zealand to CAMLAR. And on the graphic is showing you all the different countries that agreed to that proposal immediately, that supported it. So almost pretty much half of the CAMLAR countries supported that proposal straight away as it was. But again, you needed full consensus. So over time, and if you pay attention to that map, you'll see there were changes over time. So in 2013, a lot of the northern areas of the Ross Sea were removed. There was a lot of uncertainty about those areas and continued fishing interest in those areas. So those were removed, and that got the support of some major fishing countries like Norway and Japan. In 2014, more countries came and joined in consensus. Interestingly enough, Ukraine joined in consensus in 2014. Up until 2014, they had voted in unison with Russia on everything. But after the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine started having their own voice in CAMLAR. So that was a geopolitical situation that actually led to a change as well, conservation change as well. So that left, at the end of 2014, China and Russia being the two countries that were not yet supporting the Marine Protected Area. So even after 3 years of negotiations at that point, coming into 2015, those are the two countries not supporting it. So I want to just dive in for a minute about why the proposal looks the way it does. A lot of people ask me that, like, if you look at those, that blue on the map, why were those the areas that were included in the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area? There's a lot of science that was underpinning that proposal, both done by the United States and New Zealand. This is just one analysis of many that was done in front of you. It was a conservation ranking done by Grant Ballard and others, published in 2012, but done in the years before that. And the spectrum goes from light blue to dark blue, with dark blue being the areas that have the highest conservation ranking. And in this case, it was the areas that the most amount of mid-level predators used in the Ross Sea. So looking at penguins and seals and toothfish and other things, what are the areas they use the most? And so hopefully you can see the map clearly. You can see that the dark blue is really on the Ross Sea continental shelf and slope, which of course we know is important to other life as well. And then this area in particular, Islam Bank, was very important. And then, of course, there's some seamounts out here as well, and some other areas. So Islam Bank was definitely a priority area, seen as this area that all of these mid-level predators pass through during their life history in the Ross Sea. But I want to draw your attention to the black lines, the black boundary on this map. So the black boundary is the boundary of the proposed protected area in 2015. And you can see that Islam Bank is not part of that proposal. And the reason for that is that it was the main area where the fishing occurred. So in yellow it outlines the main fishing grounds for Antarctic toothfish in the Ross Sea. So you can see that Islam Bank really is a huge area for that, as well as these were some of the northern areas that I mentioned had been removed from the proposal. And then you can see fishing also comes down here along the slope, and this became the SRZ, which stands for Special Research Zone. And so this was like a core compromise in the midst of negotiations, where there was some emphasis to not allow fishing there, to protect it fully. However, some in the fishing industry insisted that that area was really important for the tag recapture program for toothfish. And essentially toothfish, they do the stock assessment based on tag recapture. And that means during commercial fishing operations, they tag a certain number of fish that are caught, and they release them. And based on the number they recatch, they actually do the stock assessment based on that. And I guess a lot of that tag recapture happened in that SRZ area. So there was a request to leave that open to fishing. And the compromise was that it would be a zone where lower levels of fishing were allowed with a higher tag rate. So that's why it's called Special Research Zone. It was considered that we're essentially tagging them higher, collecting more information, doing more research on them in that specific zone there. So it's more complicated than fishing, though. And again, I'm showing you these countries sitting across from each other. And over the course of, I was able to study this process over the course of my PhD, and to do actually research interviews with all those people who sit at the table, and to try to understand during all these years of negotiations, why is this such a difficult thing? Why are we not agreeing to this Ross Sea Marine Protected Area? And through those interviews, people used some pretty strong language talking about how divisive the MPA process had been, that it was antagonistic, hostile, stagnant, stalled, divided. Some said that the MPA process was ruined, deadlocked, at a dead end, no road open, no hope, that positions had become entrenched, that finding commonality was difficult, that the process had gone on too long, becoming divisive and polarized, and that trust was gone or broken in CAMLAR. And again, just to like look at this picture, I mean, these are people sitting around a table together that work together year after year. So to have trust be broken in such a small community is a very strong statement, to say the least. I did do these interviews in 2014, and so there were some really strong geopolitical tensions happening at the time that definitely played out. But it was more than that. There were these accusations that these protected areas were based on political rather than ecological boundaries. And when you actually map it out, you can see what some countries are talking about. The South Orkney Islands, Southern Shelf MPA was proposed by the United Kingdom in their former claimed territory. So I'm back to this claimed map that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. The proposed system of East Antarctic MPAs was being proposed by Australia and France and the EU in Australia and France's suspended territory. And then the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, they're being proposed in New Zealand's former or suspended territory. And again, with the boundaries of the Ross Sea in particular, strikingly aligning with that former territorial claim. And so this is what some countries, in particular countries like Russia, were saying, you know, what are these boundaries based on? Are they really ecological or are they political? But it is complicated in the sense that when countries have these historic territories, it tends to be where they have scientific bases. And so it tends to be where who has science about the Ross Sea? Well, the United States and New Zealand do, right? And New Zealand has a base there because it is in the place of their former territory. And it's the same with all these other countries. They tend to do science. They tend to be able to get funding to do science in places that their countries care about, which is in part driven by this. And of course, countries with historical interest in the area also can often get their governments to fund conservation efforts in the area, if that makes sense as well. So this is where science in Antarctica has often been called a double-edged sword, in the sense that it's fantastic. It really is like science for the sake of understanding the world in Antarctica, but also sometimes as far as governments are concerned, they fund science in areas that they have historic political interests. So, but these things came up during negotiations. And of course, there's this idea of precedent. The Ross Sea Marine Protected Area was huge. It was larger than anything had been proposed anywhere else in the world. And so there was concern that if we start adopting these huge protected areas in Antarctica, we'll do it in other parts of the world, and even across Antarctica. And then there were these negotiations, like what I showed you about trade-offs between protection and fishing. Currently now, like countries not wanting to close off areas that were important to fishing now, but there also was concern about closing off areas that countries might have interest in the future. So not even, there might be a country like China who isn't fishing in the Ross Sea right now, but they want to protect potential future interests to fish there. So some of these resistances came from that as well. And as I mentioned, right now we're up to like 2014, 2015. We had these major geopolitical roadblocks at the time, which are back in full force, even worse right now. But that was really a barrier where, you know, the United States was trying to lead on the Ross Sea. And there were some of these meeting negotiations where the US would just block whatever Russia proposed, Russia would block whatever the US proposed, and it had nothing to do with marine protected areas, had nothing to do with Antarctica, really. And so an important moment happened in 2013 when environmental groups, as I mentioned, there were a lot of these environmental groups working all over the world, really, in support of protecting the Ross Sea. And in Washington, D.C. in 2013, the Pew Charitable Trust worked with National Geographic to host a short screening of The Last Ocean, so a shortened version of the film, in front of John Kerry. And after that, former Secretary Kerry, decided he really wanted the Ross Sea to be part of his legacy. Now, if you know anything about John Kerry, he had a real ocean passion already. He had led on a lot of ocean conservation initiatives, not just nationally, but globally. country. And so when he learned about this effort and that the US was one of the leading countries on it, like I said, he really wanted it to be part of his legacy, and knowing that his term would be ending in 2016. So he only had so much time. And we heard these amazing stories from our friends in the State Department of these conversations that happened, presidential level conversations that happened due to John Kerry's effort, like in 2015, when President Obama incorporated a Ross Sea MPA into part of climate negotiations with China. And that led directly to China coming into CCPO-ICAR in 2015, and by the end of the meeting, supporting the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. And that was our understanding, that a lot of it had to do with those high-level diplomatic conversations that happened. But China also requested to add a krill research zone. So you can see in this version, there's this new area that was added onto the west of the Ross Sea. And in that area, basically, China had negotiated that krill research fishing would be allowed. Now, I should mention that there's never been large-scale commercial krill fishing in the Ross Sea. There doesn't even seem to be large abundances of Antarctic krill in the Ross Sea, at least not in the big swarms that we see in the peninsula that would be profitable to fish. But this was very much a precedent thing of China pushing that basically any future protected area probably is going to have this kind of zone in it. Like, they have strong interest in fishing krill. And so just as precedent, putting this krill research zone here, even if they won't ever fish for krill in the Ross Sea, that future MPAs will probably have something like this. So this left Russia as the last country not supporting the marine protected area. So as I mentioned, you know, it's every October in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia, that countries gather for CCPO-ICAR. And you just have this 2-week window when we meet for decisions to happen. You can't make decisions outside the room. So we're back in the room in 2016, again, with Russia being isolated. They're the last country not supporting the protected area. And it's 2016, Secretary Kerry's legacy. It's sort of his last moment to get this passed in this moment here. And there were some other really interesting things happening that year in the context of Russia. Russia was chairing the CCPO-ICAR meeting, which potentially provided an opportunity for leadership. 2017, Russia had declared to be a year of ecology. They had a new ecology minister. They were actually doing some conservation initiatives domestically. And they also were coming up on celebrating the 200th anniversary of them first discovering the Antarctic continent. Of course, that's contested with the US and the UK, but nonetheless, they were celebrating this moment. And so there was this real opportunity for Russian leadership. And indeed, by the end of the meeting, Russia did join a consensus. They also, like China, had some additional things they asked for, which I won't get into too much detail about, only to say that some fishing areas outside the MPA were displaced in some different ways. And one of the other things that was required for all the countries to agree was that a sunset clause was put on the marine protected area. So an expiration date. It was agreed that the protected area would be in place for 35 years, at which point it would expire unless there was consensus to continue. And the 35-year piece was pretty arbitrary in the sense that some countries were pushing for 50 years, other countries were pushing for 20, and so 35 was the halfway point between them, which is a concerning precedent because, of course, a lot of the animals that live in Antarctica live much longer than 35 years. But nonetheless, after all this effort, including, as I mentioned, at this point, it had been 14 years of scientific effort and public engagement, and government work. And we had this moment where in 2016, CCPO-ICAR came to consensus, and it was a crazy meeting. Again, these are 2-week-long meetings. And I'll never forget this year because it was a lot of what they call headed delegation meetings, where just the top delegate from each country sits together in a smaller group to discuss, and they kick everybody else out of the room. And so we kept being kicked out of the room and then invited back in, and it kept seeming like, oh, we're almost there, like we have agreement. And then a country would raise their flag and say, no, we don't agree yet. And it was the last night of the meeting when finally the chair invited everybody back and said, we have consensus, the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area is adopted. And in that moment, the room exploded in applause. Countries were hugging countries, people were crying, laughing. And it was, again, it's a serious room of people wearing suits, but everybody exploded and erupted. And the reason for that is just, it became so clear that it wasn't just this major environmental win and a gift to the future, though of course it was both of those things, but it was like the signing of the Antarctic Treaty at the height of the Cold War, the treaty being a peace treaty, right? The Ross Sea Marine Protected Area felt like a diplomatic win, showing that despite tensions between some countries, that the Antarctic continues to be this exceptional space dedicated to peace and science. And here's a map of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area that the CAMLR office actually printed right after it was adopted. And they invited all the delegates to come up and sign it. And I love this map because if you look across it, you can see all these different countries, these names from individual countries who came together to do this. And it was immediately a source of pride. In fact, this map is framed in the CAMLR office even today. So the final adopted version includes the areas under the ice shelf, and as such, it is more than 2 million kilometers squared. It is 70% off limits to fishing, and it is the world's largest marine protected area right now. So this was 2016, it was a while ago, and reflecting back, how did we get consensus on the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area? Well, we worked, as I described, very much across that science policy public interface. And I can't underestimate the role of public engagement, that huge scientific effort. We probably had millions, if not more, of public citizens engaged. We had hundreds of scientists engaged. We had that high level diplomacy, negotiating trade-offs, as I described, building and at times breaking and rebuilding trust, working with those opportunities for leadership, which all led to this political window of opportunity, this amazing initiative being passed. So since it's been passed, I get a lot of questions about, well, will it be ecologically effective, right? I showed you some of those trade-offs where the main fishing grounds was left out of the marine protected area, despite it being an ecologically important area. This is a huge remote area. And so a lot of people ask too, like, who is actually enforcing it? Is anyone enforcing it? Is there any research and monitoring? And so there's a lot of questions around that. But what I can share with you is that so research, monitoring, enforcement, management, it's all the responsibility of all the CAMLR members, right? So all the countries are supposed to work together on this. And it is the responsibility of these individual countries collectively. What I can say is that at least so far, there's been no illegal fishing reported in the Ross Sea region, and New Zealand does regular flyovers for surveillance. The US also flies over quite a bit going to McMurdo, and then there is the commercial fishery that exists outside the marine protected area, and so they certainly would report if they saw anybody as well. And so we haven't had any illegal fishing in there that we know of so far. And then actually this year, or this last year, 2022, marked the 5-year review of the protected area coming into place. So it was adopted in 2016. It actually became active in 2017, and now it's been in place for 5 years. And so last year, we actually had to pull together all the different studies that were going on in the Ross Sea. All the different countries had to submit reports on their activities. And what I can say, and I know some of you on the call are involved in this initiative, but at least in the United States, we've been trying to get the scientists organized. We actually had a planning meeting here at the University of Colorado Boulder last fall, where we tried to get even more organized about how can we do research and monitoring and support of the protected area. And so just this October, we discussed all this actually at CAMLR, and this is a website for their what they're calling their MPA information repository. It is a public website. It's cmir.org, CAMLR, MPA information repository, CMIR. And essentially we're putting all the active projects and published projects up on this repository so that we can hopefully start to understand how the MPA is working. Is it effective? What objectives is it effective at meeting? Where is it maybe not being effective? And how might we reconsider the marine protected area? It'll come up for formal review in 2027 at 10 years. And at that time, it will be discussed more in more detail about whether or not it's meeting its objectives. And so I just share with you that over its first 5 years, the United States, we had 26 active grants, 166 published studies, and then there were also extensive activities by New Zealand, Italy, South Korea, and others. So This map before you shows you the protected areas we have in Antarctica so far. And so the Ross Sea is really just a start to that representative network that I described to you that CCPO-ICAR committed to. The South Orkney Islands MPA is up on the map as well. That's the smaller one a bit further north. And then this is the 3 different protected areas that are currently under negotiation at CCPO-ICAR. So they're all quite large, and we have one in the Weddell Sea, one in the East Antarctic, and one in the Antarctic Peninsula. And all of these would help represent biodiversity and key ecological areas throughout the Southern Ocean, right? And just to share with you a tiny bit more about each of the regions, like here in the East Antarctic, this is a proposal actually came to CCPO-ICAR in 2012. So it's been under negotiation for a really long time. And but more and more studies have come out about how important some of these areas are, especially to birds and mammals there in the East Antarctic. And then the Weddell Sea is also a critically important area. I mean, this is an area where every time a research cruise goes out and samples the benthos, they find new species of benthic creatures that live there. It just has incredible biodiversity on the seafloor. It has a large amount of VMEs, or vulnerable marine ecosystems, and also, of course, lots of mammals and birds as well. And then I also have the picture up on the right there of the ice fish nests that were found last year. And hopefully you all saw this. It made the New York Times that these researchers found these amazing expansive nesting grounds of ice fish. You can see the ice fish there, and then those are their nests. Those are all kinds of eggs down there, and they're actually guarding their nests. And so this was just found last year, and that's to me how the Weddell Sea is. It's just full. It's full of so much life, and so much life that we actually either haven't yet discovered or haven't yet fully understood. So really important area for protection. And then the third place under negotiation is around the Antarctic Peninsula. And so this area is also critically important. It's probably the most threatened of all areas on that climate change map I showed you. It's where the most dramatic changes are happening. On the fishing map I showed you, it's where the highest concentration of fishing is happening. It's estimated that 70% of Antarctic krill is in this area. And so it is, again, where the krill fishery is, but it also is this amazing place where birds and mammals flock to feed on the krill that's there. So critically important, very threatened by fishing and climate change, actually, as well as tourism in this area. So a protected area being proposed there, and that one's just come online in the last few years. So just to reflect for a minute on current barriers, you can imagine the geopolitics are really difficult within CCPO-ICAR right now. Both Ukraine and Russia are members of the commission. And so, for instance, we finally met in person last October, first time in 3 years, and negotiations were just incredibly difficult. You had even to the extent that when the meeting opened, Ukraine was describing and it's just the terrible ways in which the war has impacted their ability to do even research in Antarctica, and many countries spoke in support of them. And when Russia took the floor to speak, actually most of the countries walked out to show their support for Ukraine. And so it's just very tense moment everywhere in the world, and of course that spills over down here. We do have ongoing conflicting economic interests. As I mentioned, there are just continue to be growing interests in toothfish fisheries as well as krill. And so that's something that as as countries want to fish more, that we have to continue to navigate. And of course, I feel like we lost a few years because of how hard it was to negotiate during the COVID-19 pandemic. Online diplomacy just doesn't work. And you basically had these online meetings, and they were during all different time zones. So it was really difficult timing for some countries. Some countries were having connectivity issues in terms of internet. And so it was just a really difficult time to make progress really on anything. So here we are in 2023, and I shared with you, we have these 3 proposals on the table. We probably have more that will come in the future. CCPO-ICAR has committed to having this network of protected areas. And I mentioned to you the original deadline was 2020, and the new deadline, at least internationally, the new deadline is 2030. Maybe you've heard of the campaign 30 by 30, and the whole idea is to protect 30% of the land and ocean by 2030. And surely people are thinking about this as well in the context of CCPO-ICAR. So CCPO-ICAR actually is having a special MPA meeting tentatively scheduled for June this year. And in that meeting, like I said, they only meet in October in Hobart, but they're scheduling this intersessional meeting that would just be focused on marine protected areas to happen in June in Chile. And so that will give all of us an opportunity to be in the room together, really spending time on this, which is pretty incredible that we're all going to put that effort in. And of course, in this, we need more high-level diplomacy, continued scientific effort. We need conservation organizations. And I always stress the role, like we saw in the Ross Sea, of public support and pressure. And I've just listed the different groups that are very involved in the current Antarctic campaign there at the bottom. So just two conclusions for you. One is that, as I mentioned, the Southern Ocean is under increasing human pressure. But it's also this place of exceptional governance where we've seen that increments and breakthrough can lead to consensus, these amazing political windows of opportunity, the high level diplomacy, the influence of science, media, and civil society. And so it really is this place where I feel like we can do things that maybe we can't do in other parts of the world. So with that, I thank you so much for your time and your attention. And I'm happy to just have a chat or take questions. And thank you again.
All right, thank you for an amazing story, and for your perseverance and pushing through with the Ross Sea MPA, which I think is going to be a really important thing, as you said, for many things. If you have a question, please either raise your hand, put your question in the chat, or I'll make sure we have a chance to talk about it. But while we were waiting, so you talked about how all this started in the late 1990s, early 2000s with David Ainley talking about the changes in the Ross Sea. So what I'm wondering, and then it went on from there. So in hindsight, is there something that could have been done that would have sped up the process? Was there anything that you would say in hindsight could have been done better or worked it out better, maybe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think yeah, there's a lot of things that could have maybe, I don't know. I think back to even the fact that I think some of us didn't know how CAMLAR worked at the time, right? So here we were like targeting New Zealand, even though New Zealand was then going to lead on the protected area, right? So I feel like there's just things we could have, if we'd understood CAMLAR better and knowing like who makes the decisions in the room, maybe we could have targeted those people sooner, if that makes sense. I think that could have made a big difference. But I also just think consensus moves really slowly. And so, and now that we've been negotiating some of these other MPAs for like more than 10 years, I'm like, oh, I guess the Ross Sea kind of went, didn't take too long, considering how international diplomacy works. But yeah, I think if we'd known how CAMLAR worked, we probably could have worked a little more efficiently.
Fishery outside of the protected area, have you seen any uptick, or is it still the same, or do you think those areas are helping out with the fishery?
That's a great question. So like, is that spillover effect happening, right? And so it's been in place 5 years. I don't know that we know yet that is happening, although from just like informal conversations with people, some of the industry people and scientists in the room at CAMLAR, some of them have suggested that it looks like it is. It looks like because it's protecting what we think are areas that are probably important for recruitment, that it seems like it probably is having some of that effect, but I think it hasn't been in place long enough to say with any authority.
Yeah. Any other questions for Cassandra? No, I'm be curious as things move forward with the 10-year review. Because that's probably a long enough time to, if there is an effect, to see an effect, I would think. But
right.
Anyway,
right.
Yeah,
that's a great question. I think everyone's excited to like excited and maybe scared about what the review might show. Because I think even even the conversations we've had among the science community in the United States is like, well, what would a positive or negative impact even look like, right? Like it seems like Adelie penguin, or we know Adelie penguins are increasing in the Ross Sea, right? But we're still not sure why. And is that they're supposedly one of the indicator species, like Weddell seals are also one of the indicator species. So we have a lot of things identified as indicators, but of course, teasing apart like what's climate change, what's fishing, what's like the recovery of whales, like how are all these things influencing the system. So my hope is that, yeah, within the next 5 years, we start to get a handle on that but it does take like proper monitoring, right? Like, and so much of the funding we get is like hypothesis driven, not monitoring. And so, so I think that's what we need more of, is just how can we actually do more of that? Just monitor the system, monitor those indicator species. And some people are starting to do that. So I think, and we have some of these longer time series that we can look at too, right? To try to understand change over time. Yeah.
Follow on from that, there is a question in the chat from John Harding about whether or not plastics are an additional pressure on the Antarctic ecosystems. So
yeah, great question. I would think so. I know that there's like less plastic in the Ross Sea, but my understanding is that it is being found everywhere now, including across the Southern Ocean. So yes, I would think so. And I think there's probably other threats as well. Like I just kind of loosely mentioned tourism, but my understanding is that the tourism industry was predicted to have 100,000 tourists go to Antarctica this season. Part of that is just all these people had wanted to go in COVID, and now it's reopened up. But my understanding is tourists will start going back to the Ross Sea as well. So I think that's this emerging tension we have to navigate as well. Just people traveling there, right? And the risk posed with that.
If there's time, yeah, I had a question for Cassandra, just kind of a science question. It's an enormous area, you know, all of the Southern Ocean. How well do you think we know what's actually there? I mean, you keep mentioning we're finding new things, but even, you know, everyone's going after krill and toothfish. How we probably know krill pretty well. How well do we know really what resources are there that the fishermen can take?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, it's so fun to actually be here with you guys, at least virtually, because I remember going to Old Dominion and meeting with some of you when I was still a master's student. And actually, I remember Eileen asking you, I think something about, well, what's under the Ross ice shelf? And everyone was like, I don't know. And now it's like part of the protected area, and it's still, I don't know. Like what's really under there, and do toothfish go under there? Are they like using the environment under there? So I think there's still a ton of uncertainty. I mean, we found, or I should say New Zealand scientists found the first Antarctic toothfish egg, which they published about in 2019. So it's like just the last few years that we're even finding the first egg and understanding it. So there's so much uncertainty still. And krill actually is a big thing we don't know a lot about, as well as silverfish. Like we know something about it in localized areas, but certainly not, like you said, it's a huge area, not across the whole Ross Sea. The Eastern Ross Sea, we've learned in the last few years, is much more important than we actually knew before, even when we were planning the MPA. So I do feel like we're learning more and more all the time, but of course the system is in flux, right? So I think we'll just continue to learn more, but that's why I think it's an exciting place to to keep working, because there's always new things to find, right?
No, I completely agree that it's interesting, and one of the other protecting characteristics is that it's so far. If you look at a lot of the area not being fished, it's sort of in the middle of the South Pacific, which is a long distance from any processing plant and so forth. So I think it's probably helping that it's so far away. You know, you'd have to mobilize fishing, you know, the fishing factory ships and all that sort of stuff to make it worthwhile. So I think that's helping. So all of that's very exciting.
I think that's a good point, actually. And I think that's part of why, like, because krill aren't so concentrated, but also that point you made about you'd have to catch enough of it to make it economically viable. And even in the case of toothfish, like it's economically viable for some countries like New Zealand, who's closer, but not for some others, right? And so I think it's a really good point that it probably will continue to be a barrier to some degree. But as long as toothfish is so valuable, you know, I think we'll see how that goes.
Around Kerguelen, I'm sure that there's more opportunity to base fishing fleets and so on. But anyway, fascinating to see people actually come together and put this protected area in place. So thank you.
Totally. Yeah, it is. Thank you.
I have a question about camellar and indicator species, and this may be something we need to talk about some other time.
Totally.
But the negotiations for the marine, sorry, I'm from Outer Limits here. My image, but a lot of your negotiations appeared to be about, the fishing issues and different countries wanting access and trying to protect those, in particular toothfish and krill. But how much discussion was there in the beginning with Camellar that that dealt with, what were appropriate indicator species? What were, are people really looking for that information? Was that just kind of, somewhat language within the agreement, or was there really much focused discussion about what they expect to see, for example, as an indicator of whether the marine protected area has in fact been effective?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim. Yeah, so there are Camellar has a Camellar ecosystem monitoring program. It's called KEMP, that's existed for a couple decades now. And in that, they actually have indicator species identified that are meant to be indicators of the krill fishery, like ecosystem impacts from the krill fishery. And so, of course, that's some of your seals and penguins there that have been regularly monitored to try to understand that. And so I think that there is agreement within Camellar about that, but that's in the context of the krill fishery, not an MPA. When it came for the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, we basically, after the protected area was adopted, scientists came together, a lot of Camellar scientists came together, and we had this workshop in Italy where we actually developed the research and monitoring plan and what it would look like. And it was in that discussion that we put some indicator species in there specific to the Ross Sea, specific to the marine protected area. But I wouldn't say, even though it was lots of Camellar scientists in the room, I still feel like it was, dominated by New Zealand, US, Italy. There were some countries that kind of dominated that conversation because they had been doing the research in the area. And so I do think there's still some disagreement among Camellar more broadly about what are those indicators of what, and is that sufficient? And do we have baseline information? You only have a good indicator if you actually have a good baseline data, right? So I think those are where some of the, at least current tensions are around that, making sure we have, for future MPAs in particular, good baseline and then good indicators based on that too. So yeah, but we could have a longer conversation about that for sure.
Right. Okay.
Hey, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for, like I said, a truly fascinating seminar, and mostly for your perseverance in pushing through the Ross Sea MPA. But anyway, thank you, and I'll look forward to continued conversations with you, and we all will look forward to seeing how things continue to develop.
Thanks so much, Eileen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks.
Okay.
Great talk. Thank you.
Yes.